So you've survived your first couple months of school, or maybe you just recently started because you were thrown into it. I don't know. In any case, you're trying to figure out what you need to teach. If you're lucky, you might have been handed a curriculum, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you know where to start. In this video, I'm going to go through the lesson planning process that will help you not only figure out what it is that you're supposed to teach, but also how you can tell if your students are actually learning. So if that's you and you're struggling and you're just kind of flailing, not knowing what you're supposed to be doing with these students, then make sure you stick around to the end. I wanted to talk about how to plan a lesson in a way that will produce results from your students. Or maybe you just know that you need to teach a certain standard or skill and you're like, I don't know how to break it down. In this series, I'm going to be going through the lesson planning process that I'm going to be doing for a novel that my students are going to be reading. The first thing that you want to think about when you are going to be lesson planning is to think about the standards and skills that you want to teach. So for example, I mentioned that we're going to be reading this novel called The Bear. And yeah, we're going to read this and I can do just like a normal novel study where we talk about characters and setting and plot and things like that. But what else do I want the students to get from it? How can I use this novel as a tool to teach multiple things? So in my mind, I need to come up with the standards that I think that they either need to be introduced to or that I want to spiral, which means to reteach but in a different environment. So that's the first thing you want to think about. While you're thinking about that, I also want you to envision what the end product is going to be. So what should they be able to do at the end of this lesson? Like actually be able to do and demonstrate. So, you know, for example, like if you were to go to say like a nursery or Lowe's or something like that, and you buy like a little seedling or a baby plant, you can look up what that plant is going to look like when it's fully grown. The same thing also goes for with students. What should they be able to do? How will you know that they learned? That's a big one. And especially as a new teacher, especially if you're, let's say that you were teaching one grade and then you switch to another grade, that can actually be tough to know what it is that the students should be able to do. Maybe you don't know what they're capable of. I've definitely been guilty of over or underestimating what students at the grade level that I teach could do. Especially when I started, when I switched to English from teaching band, I didn't really know what to expect. I was actually kind of too much of a hard grader, and I, nitpicked every single thing until I realized, you know what, a lot of them are actually doing really well for 7th grade. And I've run into that with teachers who maybe student taught at high school, and then they're actually teaching in middle school, and they just have these unreasonably high expectations of what a 7th or an 8th grader can do. I took on an 8th grade class last year, 5 sections of 7th and a section of 8th. And one of the first things that I did was I looked at the standards, at the 8th grade standards, to see how they compared to the 7th grade standards. I wanted to know what should they be able to do above and beyond what a 7th grader can do. So when I would look at their work, I would expect them to be able to do 7th grade level fairly well, plus X, Y, and Z. So if you're doing a grade switch, that's something that you want to investigate. I went online, looked up the standards. I also looked at student samples. I asked other 8th grade English teachers for student samples so that I could compare it to what my students are capable of doing. You just want to get a really good picture in your head of what they can do. And in your mind, you might be like, oh, they can add. I teach math and they can add. But how much can they add? How far can they add? How many steps can you give them? Do you see what I mean? Or if you're teaching social studies, if we say that we're going to teach whatever state you're in, I'm in California state history. Well, that goes back pretty far. So how much are you going to teach, say, like a 2nd grader compared to a 5th or 6th grader? Do you see what I mean? So you want to get a clear picture of what someone in your grade, in your subject, should be able to do. And then if you have any kind of student work, compare where your students are at to where they should be. And then you can plan your lesson in a way to fill in those gaps. So again, getting in your brain, clear picture of what you want them to be able to do. The next thing is, going along with this, in your pacing guide, where does this lesson fit? So for those of you who don't know what a pacing guide is, it's kind of like a map or a timeline for the entire school year of what you're going to teach and when. And you may have been given a pacing guide when you started at whatever school you're at. Some schools, it's very scripted in terms of what you teach on one day. Or you might have walked in and they just said, here are the keys to your room, good luck. So I actually feel worse for the people in the second scenario because you're kind of going blind here. You don't know how fast or how slow to go. So if you don't have a pacing guide yet, just go for the lesson that you're doing. I mean, I could tell you right now to create a pacing guide, but let's be honest, you don't know. Definitely ask other teachers what is their pacing guide. Other teachers that teach your grade level and your subject, if they have a pacing guide. If not, you can research that. You can go into Facebook groups and ask other teachers what their pacing guide is and how fast they go. But it's an estimate. It's a guide. And unless you have a scripted curriculum, you just kind of like do the best that you can at certain points in the year. And I have one in my head of like what I teach each month, but that's something that I've also discussed with my PLC. We just have decided what a natural progression is. So where in your pacing guide does this lesson fit? That's something that you want to think about. Can you fit it? I mean, are you adding more information? Are you adding a lesson? And what will that do to your other lessons if you do have other lessons planned? Or can you replace something in there? So for example, we've read other novels in the past, and so The Bear, I'm going to replace another novel that I did before with the class. I don't necessarily have to teach the same things that I did before. In fact, I didn't actually really like what I did before with that novel, if we're being honest, which is why I kind of stopped teaching it. And so I'm really excited about using The Bear to teach some standards because it'll be newish to me. And I love that when you read something over and over again, so I'm going to read this novel 5 times with 5 different classes, I'm just going to pick up more and more, and the story's just going to become richer and richer for me. So I'm actually really excited about it, and I'm making it fit in my pacing guide. One of the ways that I'm doing that is looking at the standards that I need to teach before the end of the semester, and I'm going to create materials to either teach or reteach those standards and skills. So it's something that you want to think about too. Maybe whatever lesson that you want to plan, it's a really good opportunity for you to reteach something that the kids didn't quite get, or especially if you just taught it once and you didn't get a chance to practice it under different circumstances. So where does it fit in your pacing guide? The next thing that you want to think about is, what do you have? So what's required? So some of you, like I said, you have a scripted curriculum that you have to follow. So what is required? What do you have in terms of materials? Do you have any materials? What's missing? Do you need to create materials? Do you plan on purchasing materials? Can you borrow some from other teachers? Are you all, teaching the same thing? Sometimes my PLC, we create materials together, so maybe yours is doing that as well. So what do you already have that you can use to teach this? When I started teaching English, one of my friends, she just gave me like her binders, all of her binders worth of lesson plans. And it was amazing, and I just had to follow it and just, go with it that first year. I didn't necessarily know what I was doing anyway. I didn't like all the lessons, but I didn't care. I just went with it because I just wanted to get my feet wet, and I was so grateful to have something to teach and to have like a natural progression of how to teach these things. Over the years, I'm not actually teaching anything that she gave me. But it's been about 11 years, and since then, I've decided that I want to teach other things in different ways based on my students' needs. So what can you beg, borrow, steal from someone so that you have materials? I just think at this point, especially if you're a new teacher or you're new to a grade or subject, that you don't try to create everything yourself. I just don't really recommend that right now. But you can. The problem is that it's easier to use something that's been tested already. And if you're a first year teacher and you're still, managing classroom management and all the other responsibilities of teaching, trying out a lesson that's brand new, that hasn't been tested out, I don't know. I think that could be kind of risky. But it's up to you, obviously, but it could be kind of risky. Side note, I'd run it by a veteran teacher because a lot of times they have those experienced eyes that can see where possible problems could happen. And if they can help you troubleshoot that ahead of time, then maybe this new lesson that you haven't tested can be successful. Finally, what is the level of your students? Where are they currently at? It's a good idea to get student work as soon as possible. I have them write fairly soon, but it's just like a really low risk. It's not scary. Write a letter to me and I give them a prompt and see how well they follow instructions and if they know how to write a letter, things like that. So if you can get copies of their student work, then you can assess where are my students at. That way you know how big of a gap you have to fill. You may be pleasantly surprised. You may think that they can't do something or that they have no knowledge about a topic, and then you give them some kind of little formative quiz and you realize actually they learned about it in the previous grade. That's really important to do some kind of pre-assessment so that you know where you're supposed to go. Now let me know in the comments below, what have you observed from student work that you already have? Is it something that has exceeded your expectations or were you kind of unpleasantly surprised? Let me know in the comments. There have been previous years where I look at my students' writing and I see patterns. I see a lot of patterns and things that I feel like I need to undo or fix, or skills that I feel like they should already know but they don't. So that's where I'm going to fill in that hole because I want to make sure that by the time I pass them off to the next grade, they've got this plus more solidified. As you're trying to figure out the actual lessons, the daily lessons in this, I guess I should have clarified in the beginning when I'm talking about a lesson plan, I mean like a whole unit. So as you're planning along with the daily lessons, you want to think about progression. Is it going in a logical order? Is it taking them from where they're at to where you want them to be, or at least to the next step? And then you're just going to go gradually, step by step, until what they've produced looks like what you want. Of course, it's different for different subjects. I know what I want it to look like in English when they write something, in math, maybe when they, work out their problems, you're seeing fewer inconsistencies, or in science, you're seeing them write better lab write-ups, things like that. You want to know where they're at so that you know where they need to be. So a lot of times I teach to the middle, meaning that I know like what the mid-ground is in terms of if you have your students at like a high and a low level. So I teach to the middle and I have scaffolds for my students that struggle. And if you're new and you haven't heard that terminology, scaffolding is where you create additional supports so that the students who struggle can be successful. So I'll use things like graphic organizers that have like leading questions that are really step by step for them so that they can follow along. And for a while, I'm going to give them those graphic organizers. I mean, you should see what I use when I have them write a body paragraph. It's sentence by sentence that I have it split up, and it says what they need to write in each sentence of their paragraph. And then as they progress and they show me that they can do that, then I start taking some of those scaffolds away. It's kind of like training wheels. Similarly, you also want to have something for the students that are accelerated, for the students that already know it, because you don't want to bore them. They resent having to be the ones to carry the rest of the class. You want to give them something that's a little more complex. Definitely don't want to give them scaffolds because they don't need it. They want to be challenged. I wouldn't necessarily give them more work, but I would give them a different twist. So while maybe some of my students are working on how setting moves the plot forward, my accelerated students may have to analyze examples of 2 different themes, something like that. So it's not necessarily more work, but it's just going to be higher level questioning and more complex. So you need to have that planned out so that while you're teaching the basic skill to the middle, you're not leaving anyone behind, but you're also not slowing down the people that need to move forward, that need the enrichment and need to be stretched. That's kind of like the mindset that you need to get in. Those are some of the things that you need to plan for ahead of time before you even start planning your lesson. Just starting to plan with the end in mind, and also figuring out what it is that you need to do to supplement your curriculum, or even if you have no curriculum, I really highly suggest that you beg, borrow, steal. Like I said, I don't actually mean steal. Find materials, don't try to reinvent the wheel, especially your first year. It's really not gonna be worth it for you. You might get really excited because you're like, oh, I wanna teach this, I think it'd be really fun. Go see if somebody else has taught that and use their lesson, and then change it and tweak it as the years go on and you decide that you're gonna do that. So if you found this video useful, then be sure to hit that like button because it helps the algorithm, and also be sure to subscribe so that anytime I post a new video, which I will be doing on a regular basis about things that I know you're struggling with, you'll be notified.